As we begin today's lesson, we are sitting on the doorstep of the book of 1 Kings. And this is the 11th book now in our journey through the Bible. We're making some progress. So before we enter 1 Kings, we'll take a quick look at the illustration that I've drawn up. It's entitled the Book of Kings, so that we might have a more clear picture in our minds as to the key players in the four books on the diagram. That would be 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. We're entering 1 Kings, having already gone through 1st and 2nd Samuel. As you can see, all four books are about Israel's kings. Samuel, as you may recall, was the last of Israel's judges. So Samuel can be thought of as the bridge, in a sense, the bridge between God's dealing with Israel under the judges and God dealing with Israel under her kings. In the book of 1 Samuel, for instance, we saw Israel demanding a king. They wanted a king. Although God had performed as their king from the inception of the nation, he told them, "I was your king." So they were rejecting his kingship over them. They wanted their own king. God had been leading Israel through the judges that he raised up for that specific purpose. So he was their king through the judges. However, as we learned in 1 Samuel, the people weren't satisfied with God's reign over them through those judges, so they requested a king that they might be governed in the same manners as the nations around them, nations that God had told them earlier they were not to pattern themselves after. They were supposed to be different from the nations around them, and now they want a king so they can be just like the nations around them. As a result of their rejection of him as their king, God granted their request. And he gave them the king of their choosing. The people wanted Saul, so God told Samuel to anoint Saul to be king over Israel. They wanted Saul, God gave them Saul. Now what was God doing? Well, the answer is he was allowing Israel to see how taking matters into their own hands rather than trusting in God to exercise his name on their behalf graciously wouldn't bring them success. It would only stand as proof of their failure of their flesh. You see, the nation didn't have it so good under the king that they had chosen. All those oppositionites that were in the land, we call them oppositionites throughout our studies, they kept knocking on Israel's doorstep, and the Israelites continued to suffer under the oppression those oppositionites kept bringing them under Saul's reign. Things could have gone differently had Israel been willing to acknowledge nationally their incapacity and then called upon the name of the Most High God who had brought them into the land He'd promised to the descendants of Abram in the first place. Things could have gone differently had they learned the lesson their wilderness wanderings were designed to teach them. Instead, they rejected God's reign, as we said, and they demanded their own king once they were in the land. Throughout the book of 1 Samuel, we watch the king of God's choice, David, flee from the king the nation had chosen, Saul. So yet in spite of all the failures of David's flesh, and we enumerated them, they were numerous, as you recall, God remained with David in order that David might come to appreciate not only the capacity resident in the name of the Most High God, but his lack of capacity to merit God working on his behalf graciously. If God was going to work on David's behalf, it would have to be graciously. God could never work on David's behalf meritoriously. David would never merit that. So God was simply allowing King David to see that and to appreciate the meaning of his name and his need of God's name. Now, as we enter the book of 2 Samuel, we see 1 Samuel there has to do with the reign of King Saul, David fleeing from King Saul. Then as we entered the book of 2 Samuel, we saw the beginning of King David's reign over the nation, as God enabled David to actually sit on what had formerly been Saul's throne. Saul was dead, and the people were now ready to recognize David as their king. But did David's kingship over the nation resolve the issues of King David's flesh? I think we saw that was not the case. As those who've been following our studies well know, nothing can fix the flesh. It's irreparable. God didn't plan a way to Christianize it or to make it better or to reorganize that flesh and make it something it isn't. He crucified it. And he crucified it in the person of God's flesh. There wasn't a day in King David's life when he measured up to the righteousness belonging to the Most High God by way of his fleshly performance. He never measured up. Had David known the Apostle Paul, I'm sure David would have agreed with Paul's statement in Romans chapter 7, verse 18, "For I know that in me," and I don't know if that's in there, and it's not, "For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. For the will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good, I can't find it," he said. What is true of David and of Paul is no less true of us. This was the reason for Paul's anguished cry in verse 24 of the same chapter, where Paul said, "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death?" And I think there it is, the "O wretched man." So we've got a slide in place of the Romans 7:18 slide. The answer is God would deliver Paul. God would deliver Paul, who justifies sinners on the basis of their belief rather than on their behavior. The people of Israel, who had sworn that they could merit a righteous standing before God by way of their performance, were failing to learn the lesson of their failure and their need of God. This is as good a time as any to look forward in history at Paul's statement in Romans chapter 9, verses 30 through 32. Here, Paul writes, "What shall we say then? That the Gentiles, which followed not after righteousness," they weren't even trying to become righteous through performance, "have attained to righteousness, but not through performance, through faith, even the righteousness which is of faith. But Israel, which followed after the law of, or concerning righteousness," do this and you'll be righteous, do that and you won't be, "hath not attained to the law of righteousness. Wherefore, or why not? Because they sought it, righteousness, not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law." They thought they could be righteous through their performance, through their law keeping. And the law was designed to teach them the impossibility of that venture. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone. So as we continue our journey through the Bible, we're looking at that failure of the nation Israel. God's showing us over and over their failure. He's showing us in these studies that as a nation, they never ceased placing confidence in their flesh. They refused to confess their failure under the law contract and to call upon God to exercise his name on their behalf and do so graciously. They refused under the leadership of the judges, as we've seen. And now they're sitting under the leadership of King David, leadership about to come to an end as we stand at the entrance of the book of 1 Kings. If you glance back at the buckets of wrath, and here they are once again, the book of Kings illustration, for instance, let's glance back at that. You'll see that the book of 1 Chronicles goes hand in hand with the book of 2 Samuel. Because 1 Chronicles gives us the record of King David's reign with more of a detailed account in certain places and from a different perspective, and other places not so detailed. So as we go through the Bible, understand that as we go through 2 Samuel, David's reign, this is what you'll find the story of in 1 Chronicles. Saves us a lot of time going through an entire book of 1 Chronicles, knowing that when you read that book on your own, you'll be seeing what we see in 2 Samuel and sometimes a more detailed account. The same thing with 1 Kings. When we look at 1 Kings and 2 Kings, the story in 1 Kings and 2 Kings appears in the 2 Chronicles. We see the genealogy record there in the Chronicles, and some things in certain context from a different perspective, but the same stories. And 2 Chronicles covers the account from the reign of Solomon there, as we see in 1 Kings, all the way up through the captivity, which would be the 5th bucket of wrath that God promised Israel if they couldn't live up to that contract, which they'd sworn they could upkeep. So 1 and 2 Kings records the political perspective of Israel, whereas 1 and 2 Chronicles are sometimes referred to as the divine perspective, a spiritual perspective. At least 9 times in the book of Chronicles we see the question, is it not written in the book of Israel and Judah, in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah? So they correspond. I bring these things to your attention before we enter 1 Kings, so that you can see how these books overlap one another, interrelate. And while you may see certain situations recorded in more detail, as I said, in the Chronicles account, other things are recorded in more detail in the book of Kings. So both Kings and Chronicles refer to the same time period in Israel's history. Keep in mind Israel's golden age, her interlude of blessing that came prior to the pouring out of the 2nd bucket of wrath, the law contract called for, was taking place during King David's reign, and also during the reign of King Solomon. So, or some of it, a portion of it. So you can see the golden age sitting there right after the 1st bucket of wrath. This 2nd bucket of wrath was sitting on Israel's future. Could they not live up to the dictates of the contract? And God knew they wouldn't. So we should be watching for Israel's interlude of blessing to come to a halt, and her promised 2nd bucket of wrath to come tumbling down on their heads, which it did, as we move toward the mid part of 1 Kings. As proof of the continual failure of the flesh of man, God knew that King David wanted to take a census of the people. This is an interesting account here. The Bathsheba incident was behind him at this point in time, but the pride of life hadn't left him. In the final chapter of 1 Kings, chapter 24, notice this statement that opens up this chapter. 24 verse 1, "And again the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, Go number Israel and Judah." You see, the Lord's moving David to go number Israel and Judah. "For the king said to Joab, the captain of the host," and this was David's nephew, which was with him, "Go now through all the tribes of Israel," David told his nephew, "from Dan even to Beersheba, and number ye the people, that I may know the number of the people." Now notice that expression. There's more in that than you see on the surface. That I may know the number of the people. You see something there? This census would be yet another failure of David's flesh. Why then, someone might raise the question, would verse 1 say that God moved against Israel by telling David to go and number Israel and Judah? Well, the answer is an easy one. Just as God used Israel's enemies as a means of chastising Israel in time past, not by putting it into their enemies' hearts to oppose the nation, but by allowing Israel's enemies to exercise what God had already known was in their hearts. He was now doing this with King David. He knew what was in King David's heart. So he said, okay, he knew David wanted to go number the people because David wanted to know how many. Okay, go number the people. God knew what David was thinking, and he had known it all along. This is God's foreknowledge. David wanted to number the people because David was proud. He was proud of the strength and the growth the nation had realized under his reign. He was proud of his position. David was taking the credit, in a sense, for Israel's interlude of blessing, as though he had arranged it. He had brought it about. He wanted to boast. David wanted to boast in what he had come to suppose that he had been the accomplisher of. And since God was angry at Israel, he gave David the opportunity to carry out what David's pride nature wanted to do. Go and number the people, God said, and David did just that, but not before David was warned by Joab. Of all likely men, it wasn't Joab, but Joab warned him. Listen to Joab, who surprisingly, as it seems, questions David's motives in verse 3. Here Joab tells the king, he said unto the king, Now the Lord thy God, not the Lord our God, the Lord my God, but the Lord thy God, add unto the people how many soever they be, an hundredfold, and the eyes of my lord the king may see it. But why doth my lord the king delight in this thing? He sees a proud, this shows you that Joab, his nephew, was beginning to see a proud uncle, Uncle David. You suppose that Joab noticed David's pride? Joab's question didn't do a thing to shake David's prideful ambition, though. Verse 4 goes on to say, notwithstanding that warning, the king's word prevailed against Joab and against the captains of the host. Evidently, they weren't anxious to go out and do this census either. Even the commanders of Israel's forces were questioning him. It seems that. Apparently, David was wearing his pride on his sleeve. What difference would the size of Israel's armies possibly make to David? God had been the one giving them the victories from the get-go. It had been God, not David or his armies. God had been working on their behalf. Now, David wants to know, how many are there of us? And it was the fighting men he was interested in. And Joab, the captain of the host, went out from the presence of the king to number the people of Israel. So Joab's doing as he was commanded. This turned out to be an amazing census, by the way, numbers-wise. Watch verse 9 as the tally is revealed to David. And Joab gave up the sum of the number of the people unto the king, and there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men that drew the sword. This would be 20 years and up. Remember, they couldn't go to war unless they were 20 years and older. And this would not include men, women, children, the women and children of all ages, and the men who were over 20 but couldn't fight for whatever reason. 800,000 valiant men that drew the sword. And the men of Judah were 500,000 men. That comes to a whopping 1,300,000 men altogether. Expressed another way, nearly 1.5 million fearless fighters in the nation Israel. You see why they were winning their victories through King David. The verse states that they were valiant men that drew the sword. Of course, God was behind them. Valiant means brave, means courageous, bold, not a sissy among the bunch of fighters in Israel. And of course, true to form, David recognized his failure in asking for that sentence so that he could know the number. He regretted his decision, and he confessed that he regretted it after he committed it, of course. Here are his words in verse 10. And David's heart smote him after he numbered the people. And David said unto the Lord, I have sinned greatly. I have sinned greatly in that I have done. And now I beseech thee, O Lord, take away the iniquity of thy servant, for I have done very foolishly. David was always willing to admit his failure. He had numerous failures, but he was always able to confess that he had failed. There would be consequences to pay, of course, all over again, as every earthly decision bears an earthly consequence. And, of course, with working with God under a law contract, there would not only be that natural consequence of a faulty decision, there would be that supernatural consequence as well. The Lord sent a pestilence, meaning a plague, upon the nation that had been operating with God according to a law contract they had sworn they could uphold. They were not doing so. As we see the failure of the nation as a whole here, 70,000 men succumbed to that scourge that was brought upon Israel. That's a little over 5% of the troops. 5% may seem like a low ratio in a nation of multiple millions, but that's still a football stadium full of people if you think about it, as David had once again proven the failure of his flesh. He had asked for that census that had been in his heart all along. So as we open the door to the book of 1 Kings, verse 1, the entrance of 1 Kings records David as an elderly man, and therefore an elderly king, who was suffering from circulatory problems, and these problems naturally coming with his advanced age. Look at verse 1 of chapter 1. Now King David was old and stricken in years, and they covered him with clothes, but he gat no heat. We wouldn't say gat today, but we would say he was a cold guy. He got no heat. Now older folks can relate to what we're talking about here. You put a blanket over my feet here at night, but that's King David. He's well up in years. Not to worry, his aides had an idea. Verse 2 spells it out. Wherefore his servant said unto him, Let there be sought for my lord the king a young virgin. Pardon me. And let this young virgin stand before the king, and let her cherish him, and let her lie in thy bosom, that the king may get heat. So they've come up with this idea. A word of caution is due here. Do not try this out at home. Where in the world were David's wives and his children? Because he had numerous wives and children. Were there not others who could kept him warm, but they did not? Did the plot of his aides work? Well, verses 3 and 4 reveal the results. So they sought for a fair damsel throughout all the coasts of Israel, and they found Abishag, a Shunammite, and brought her to the king. And the damsel was very fair, and cherished the king, and ministered to him, but the king knew her not. It was not a sexual relationship, as we wouldn't have expected it to have been a sexual relationship at this stage in David's life. But had David been a little younger, be sure, it's a pretty safe bet to say that David would have had another wife, or at least another concubine. He's nearing the end of his life at this point here, folks. Were his aides seeking to garner his favor in hopes of maybe a reward before his death? Is that why the young virgin to sleep next to David? That we'll never know. What we do know is that David was old and stricken in age, as the verse said, and evidently in need of a full-time nurse. And that's exactly what the Shunammite maiden became to King David, a very intimate nurse. As sleeping at his bosom, she slept with David, but not a sexual relationship. Now, do you remember when God told David, after the murder of Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, that the sword would never depart from David's house because he had taken Bathsheba to be his wife? In other words, that there would always be a conflict in David's household? Well, this is where another son of David begins to enter the picture. It's his son Adonijah, who would be bringing unrest in David's house at this point in time. You can see the arrow points to Adonijah there on the bottom. Amnon was dead. Absalom was dead. Amnon had a physical relationship with Tamar, Absalom's brother, a direct brother, and so Amnon's was actually in a relationship with his sister. And of course, because of that, we know that Amnon was slain. Absalom saw to that. Now his son Adonijah is coming into the picture. Because of the opportunity David's age afforded Adonijah, and because it looked like David's fighting days were well over at this point in his life, Adonijah decided to use that situation to make a move on his father's throne. This would be a coup, so to speak. So he enlisted Joab. Who was Joab? He was the nephew of David, the leader of Israel's forces. He enlists Joab, the leader of Israel's armies, and Abiathar, a priest of the royal court, David's court, to aid him in his cause to overthrow his father, but he would do it in a different way, and we'll cover that. In case you've forgotten who Abiathar was, by the way, and that isn't difficult to do with all these names you've been seeing all along. Abiathar was the son of Ahimelech. Does anyone remember Ahimelech? He was the high priest that Saul's forces killed, along with all the priests and the people of Nob. But there was one that escaped, and it was the son of that high priest, Abiathar. So he naturally fled to David. David had stolen the showbread, and he'd taken, or not stolen it, he asked for it and got it. And then he asked for the sword, and Ahimelech gave him Goliath's sword. So when King Saul's forces killed the priesthood of Nob, along with the people of that city, Abiathar, as I said, was the one who escaped and fled to David, who had himself been fleeing from King Saul. When David became king, naturally, he appointed Abiathar to be a chief priest of his royal court, along with the priest Zadok. Abiathar had been loyal to King David for many years, but now, with David's advanced age, Abiathar had been convinced to transfer his allegiance to David's son, Adonijah, who had set himself up as king. Adonijah was calling himself king and claiming the kingship, and Joab and Abiathar were going right along with him. Of course, he wasn't right in David's backyard, in a manner speaking. He was a little distance from David when he was doing this. Fortunately for King David, priest Zadok remained loyal, along with Benaiah, a major leader in the army of Israel at that time, and Nathan, the prophet, had also been loyal to David. So King David had some men that were on his side, and those men understood that Adonijah was usurping his father's throne, claiming himself to be king. Well, Nathan, the prophet, decided to do something about that. He went straight to Bathsheba. And watch Nathan take action in chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. Wherefore Nathan spake unto Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, saying, Hast thou not heard that Adonijah the son of Haggith doth reign? He was reigning in Judah, by the way. And David our Lord knoweth it not. Now therefore come, let me, I pray thee, give thee counsel, that thou mayest save thine own life and the life of thy son Solomon. What did Nathan want Bathsheba to do? Well, here it is in verse 13. Go and get thee unto King David, and say unto him, Didst not thou, my lord, O king, swear unto thy handmaiden, meaning herself, saying, Assuredly Solomon thy son shall reign after me, and he shall sit upon thy throne? Why then doth Adonijah reign? So Bathsheba wonders why it wasn't Solomon, it was Adonijah. And Adonijah was already calling himself king. Nathan, the prophet, then came into the room. And he confirmed Bathsheba's words. He confirmed that David had promised Bathsheba earlier that Solomon was to reign as king after him. Bathsheba wanted David to take action and do something about this son of yours who's out of control. And we see that in verses 20 and 21. And thou, my lord, O king, the eyes of all Israel are upon you. They're upon thee, that thou shouldest tell them who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. The people of Israel want to know who you've picked. Adonijah selected himself, and they want to know what you have to say about this. Otherwise, it shall come to pass when my lord the king shall sleep with his fathers, that I and my son Solomon shall be counted offenders for sitting where they were sitting, as within that royal family. You see, Adonijah, expecting his father to die at any time, had hoped that his father would leave well enough alone, not say anything about his claim to be king, and that David's death would occur before he had the opportunity to name a successor. That way Adonijah would obtain his kingship by default, by declaring himself king in Judah. And by the way, that was some 90 miles away from Jerusalem where David was. He wasn't operating right in David's backyard, as we said earlier. But word travels fast, does it not? And after all, Nathan was indeed a prophet, and now Nathan was putting David on the spot. He's reigning and you don't know anything about it. He's already claimed the kingship. What are you going to do about this, David? The people want to know. Who did you pick? David had to act. And so act he did. He first called for Bathsheba to be brought back to his side, where we pick it up with verse 29. And the king sware. Now he didn't issue a tirade of curse words. That wasn't what it said. He could very well have, but he didn't. The king sware and said, as the Lord liveth, it's an oath, that hath redeemed my soul out of all distress. He knew the source of his righteousness and the source of everything else he had gotten. Even as I swear unto thee by the Lord God of Israel, saying, assuredly Solomon thy son shall reign after me, and he shall sit upon my throne in my stead. Even so will I certainly do this day. So David had made up his mind. It's not going to be Adonijah. Sorry, it's going to be Solomon. David then called for Zadok the priest, who had remained loyal, and Nathan the prophet, who had forewarned him, and he had them anoint his son Solomon to be king over all the people, both Judah and Israel, as recorded in verses 39 and 40 of our text in chapter 1. And Zadok the priest took an horn of oil out of the tabernacle and anointed Solomon. And they blew the trumpet, and all the people said, God save King Solomon. The people are recognizing his rightful kingship. And all the people came up after him, and the people piped with pipes and rejoiced with great joy, so the earth rent with the sound of them. You can imagine the uproar of those millions of Israel who were so thrilled that Solomon was on the throne and David had named his successor. Now David's son Adonijah and his men heard the uproar. And they soon learned of the anointing of Solomon that had come by David's decree. Naturally, what would Adonijah be thinking? Well, he was fearing for his life. But Solomon spared him. Chapter 2 of 1 Kings opens with the death of David and the establishment of Solomon's throne. They are verses 10 and 12 of 1 Kings in chapter 2. Verse 10 states, so David slept with his father. So here we have the death of David in 1 Kings, and was buried in the city of David. Then sat Solomon on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was established greatly. The word greatly could be underlined because it was indeed established greatly, as we're going to see. Where was Israel at this point in their history? They were in that time of that interlude of blessing, Israel's golden age. Keep in mind that God had promised David that due to his behavior with Bathsheba, the sword would not depart from David's house, but that conflict and injury within his immediate family would continue to play itself out, and that's precisely what took place. Amnon had been killed, remember, by Absalom for raping Absalom's sister Tamar, who was Amnon's half-sister. Then Absalom, in an attempt to usurp his father David's throne, was slain by Joab, David's nephew and the military commander of Israel's forces, as Absalom, you might recall, was hanging from the hair of his head from that oak tree. He'd become entangled with, his hair had become entangled with that oak tree. So David had lost 2 of his sons. 3 sons when we consider David's firstborn with Bathsheba, who died shortly after birth. So count them up. He had lost his firstborn, who died with Bathsheba's firstborn. He had lost Amnon. Now he's lost Absalom. How many sons does that make that David's lost? 3 sons. But what had David said in response to Nathan's parable about the man who stole the poor man's ewe lamb? Do you remember what David said? These are the words that came directly from David's mouth in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 6. And he, the one who had stolen the precious ewe lamb of the poor man, shall restore the lamb, what's it say there? 4-fold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Would David lose a 4th son? Well, what had God been teaching the people of Israel all along, including King David, about the meaning of his name? To recall the encapsulation of God's name, the 2 encapsulations of God's name. We looked at this in an earlier part of our journey through the Bible, the I am and the I am that I am concepts. The I am that I am aspect of God's name has to do with his eternal faithfulness. God is never anything less than perfectly faithful. Israel could depend upon that. When David said, the rich man who showed no pity would have to pay 4-fold, and then God replied that the sword would not depart from David's house, David could expect that God would be faithful to hold him accountable, hold him at his word concerning that 4-fold payment. What happened next in David's household demonstrates exactly what I'm talking about. Solomon spared Adonijah's life. when he learned that Adonijah was ready to recognize and honor Solomon's rightful kingship. Solomon said he wouldn't kill Adonijah. But that life-sparing had come with a condition, as we see in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 22. We're moving ahead now in 1 Kings. Solomon said, if he, Adonijah, will show himself a worthy man, then shall not a hair of him fall to the earth. But if wickedness shall be found in him, he shall what? He shall die. His life depended upon him showing himself a worthy man. The question is, would Adonijah show himself to be a worthy man? Well, let's take a look at Adonijah, because he's going to set the stage for us in 1 Kings chapter 2. After having had his life spared by King Solomon, his half-brother, Adonijah requested an audience with Bathsheba, David's wife, and his brother's mother. Isn't it interesting that Adonijah would not seek out the man David, his father, but would instead go to the woman Bathsheba? The reason for that, I believe, is the same reason why Lucifer hadn't sought out Adam, but instead sought out Eve in the garden. Both Lucifer and Adonijah believed they could play on the woman's more delicate, more sensitive emotions. Let's pick up the story in chapter 2, verse 13, as Adonijah is going to do that very thing with Bathsheba. Verse 13, and Adonijah, the son of Haggith, came to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, and she said, comest thou peaceably? And he said, peaceably. He said, moreover, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And she said, say on. And he said, verse 15, thou knowest that the kingdom was mine, and that all Israel set their faces on me, that I should reign. Of course, he was kissing the babies, remember, and tell them he would solve their problems. Howbeit the kingdom is turned about, and has become my brother's. Do you see his play on her emotions? He was having his own pity party there. He wanted her to join it, for it was his from the Lord. And now I ask one petition of thee. I'm only asking you one little thing. Couldn't you do me one little favor here? That's the least you could do for me. Deny me not. And she said unto him, say on. So he does in verse 17. And he said, speak, I pray thee, unto Solomon the king. Speak unto Solomon the king. I'm not going to do it. I want you to go speak on my behalf. Speak unto Solomon the king, for he will not say thee nay. He won't tell you no. That he give me Abishag the Shunammite to wife. And Bathsheba said, well, I will speak for thee unto the king. Now wait a minute. Had Abishag not been the fair virgin damsel who had become a faithful and intimate, if not physically intimate, nurse to his father? Abishag had slept beside King David in King David's bed in order to provide him warmth, as we read earlier on. The expression in chapter 1, verse 2, we'll not pull it up, but I'm sure you'll recall it, was, let her lie in thy bosom, David. And David did that very thing. So King David and Abishag were bedmates. In a very real sense, Abishag belonged to David. She cherished him, we were told. It's just that David had not taken advantage of the intimacy to which Abishag had availed him. Now, David's son, Adonijah, was requesting an intimate relationship with Abishag, who had belonged to his father. You see a problem here when it comes to the law contract? Furthermore, Adonijah had circumvented David by going directly to his wife Bathsheba behind his father's back. He even intimated to Bathsheba that he believed David would indeed tell him no if he'd gone to David directly, but as he said, he will not tell you no. He will not say nay to you. You can get more out of Dad than I can get out of Dad, was what he was really saying. He certainly wasn't showing himself a man, a worthy man. Would you say that Adonijah was showing himself worthy or not worthy? He was showing that he couldn't be trusted. That's what he was showing. You see another picture sitting here, folks? I don't know if you've caught this, but it's an interesting thing. Do you recall all those instances where we illustrated how David typified Christ? Adonijah had not only sought King David's kingdom, he was now seeking the woman who had belonged to David. You see something coming here? Has Satan ever ceased seeking Christ's kingdom? Did Satan not continually seek to own for himself the wife that rightfully belonged to God's son, Israel? If David typified Christ, and he did in so many instances, then Adonijah certainly typified the one who was opposed to Christ. Not only the Antichrist, but Satan himself. Well, Bathsheba did precisely as Adonijah requested. She went straight to Solomon, her son. Now watch her make her plea in verses 20 and 21. Then she said, I desire one small petition of thee. She's asking Solomon here. I pray thee, say me nay. I pray thee, say me not nay. Oh, just one little thing. How can you deny me this one little thing? And the king said unto her, Ask on, my mother, for I will not say thee nay. And she said, Let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah thy brother to wife. Would King Solomon allow his emotions to get the best of him in this situation? Or would King Solomon see Adonijah for the traitor to David that Adonijah had already proven himself to be? And if he had been a traitor to David, who was not only his father, but the Lord's king, would Adonijah not also be a traitor to Solomon, the Lord's chosen successor to David's throne? Well, King Solomon knew the answer to that. Adonijah had not shown himself worthy. And remember, that was a prerequisite for Solomon to continue to spare Adonijah's life. Watch as King Solomon gives his judgment to Bathsheba, beginning in verse 22. And King Solomon answered and said unto his mother, And why dost thou ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also, for he is mine elder brother, even for him and for Abiathar the priest, who was also a traitor, and for Joab the son of Zeruiah, who also was a traitor. Adonijah had been no less a traitor to David than Abiathar, who assisted Adonijah in his usurpation of David's throne, and Joab, the commander of David's forces, who had gone along with Adonijah's throne usurping plan. All three had been traitors to the throne God established and to God's chosen king. If King Solomon was to execute just judgment, Adonijah had to die. Well, let's look in on Solomon's decree in verses 24 and 25. Here we go. Now therefore, as the Lord liveth, which hath established me, and set me on the throne of David my father, and who hath made me an house, as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death this day. And King Solomon sent by the hand of Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and Benaiah, he fell upon Adonijah, that he died. The Hebrew word translated fell upon means to invade or to impact by accident or violence. I think we know which one took place here. However, King Solomon's judgment, however the case, it was carried out. Benaiah put Adonijah to death. Benaiah certainly impacted Adonijah in a violent way. Adonijah was dead. Now think back to the fourfold payment for a moment that had come from David, his own mouth. And tell me if David, the rich man, had to pay fourfold for his lack of pity for the poor man and the single ewe lamb Uriah. He paid in a fourfold way. David had taken Bathsheba, Uriah's only ewe lamb. Now death had not only taken David's firstborn son through Bathsheba, it had also come to Amnon, the second son of David, then to Absalom, a third son, and finally to Adonijah, a fourth son of King David. The rich man thief in the parable of Nathan was suffering. He had suffered a fourfold way in that the sword didn't leave his house. Injury, conflict, we could see he lost 4 sons. David had repaid in a fourfold way for what he had done to Uriah, as David himself had decreed to be the just reward for the rich man's crime. And by the way, King Solomon also had Benaiah fall upon Joab. He didn't get away with anything. The leader of the forces who betrayed David, Solomon had Benaiah fall upon Joab. So Solomon was cleaning house, in a manner of speaking. He was king, and he was cleaning house of those traitors to King David. There is a highlight in 1 Kings chapter 3 that we need to point out at this time. Israel was not only at the zenith of her golden age right here. King Solomon's introspection here in chapter 3 proved to be a high point for King Solomon the man. He began to realize his lack of capacity before the Most High God, in light of the capacity resident in the Most High God's name. Why, that was the lesson God wanted his nation to learn all along, was it not? So God knew Solomon's thoughts, and he appeared to Solomon in a dream. And notice what God said in chapter 3, verse 5 and 6 to Solomon. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, Ask what I shall give thee. Now watch Solomon recognize the Lord's capacity. And Solomon said, Thou hast showed unto thy servant David my father great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth and in righteousness and in uprightness of heart with thee. And thou hast kept for him this great kindness, that thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. In other words, you worked graciously on my father David's behalf. You did that, Most High God. You gave him a son to sit on his throne, and I am that son. Then right after acknowledging God's greatness and God's mercy that he'd shown to David his father, watch Solomon recognize his own lack of capacity when it came to governing the people of God's nation. And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father. And I am but a little child. I know not how to go out or come in. In other words, I'm not capable of doing anything on my own. And thy servant is in the midst of thy people which thou hast chosen. Speaking of himself, a great people that cannot be numbered nor counted for multitude. That's precisely the mindset he should have had. He called himself a child. Now the Hebrew word for child here literally means a boy, and it covers the span from infancy to adolescence. Why would God put an adolescent on the throne as king over Israel, over multitudes too numerous to count? Why an adolescent? Why wouldn't he put a much more capable, much more experienced man in such a lofty position as that? He did so for the purpose, folks, of proving that the power would be of him and not of the person to whom he had given a certain position. God was proving that he would have to become for his nation and his king what his nation had no capacity to be for him. Again, it was all about the lesson. God was teaching his people about his name. We keep coming back to that. This has been the theme throughout our study of God's plan to repossess the earthly realm, teaching his people the meaning of his name. And, of course, the nation Israel that God chose to use in connection with that plan. When God said, ask what I shall give thee, the Lord was in essence saying, let me show you the capacity resident in the who I am statement, Solomon. I'll show you my capacity, the capacity resident in my name. If you'll simply call upon me to exercise my name on your behalf, I'll do so. What shall I give you? Ask what you will. It shall be done. Is that not precisely what the Lord Jesus Christ would later say to those to whom would inherit the earthly kingdom? Here it is in John, chapter 14, verses 13 and 14. Whatsoever you shall ask in my name, that will I do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you shall ask anything in my name, I will do it. Now God's saying to Solomon, before Christ ever came on the throne, ask what I shall do for you. Not could be. Ask anything in my name and I will do it. Not could do it, might do it, should do it, but I will do it. Does that sound at all like ask what I shall give thee, Solomon? Do you see it? You see why I've said that God was giving Israel a taste of her promised earthly kingdom to come during the days of Kings David and Solomon? Watch what I can do for you, Israel, if you'll simply acknowledge your lack of capacity, as evidenced in your failure under the law contract, and call upon me to exercise my unlimited capacity on your behalf. Ask what I shall do for you, Solomon. So Solomon did. Notice his request in 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 9. Give therefore thy servant great health, wealth, and prosperity. Give therefore thy servant a wonderful wife. Give therefore thy servant a new job. Sorry, I lost the last one because of my attitude, but if you'll help me find a new one. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this, thy so great a people? Wow, it wasn't help me with my finances. It wasn't I've gotten myself in over my head, or help me find a wife, Lord. I'm tired of the single lonely life and sleeping in a single bed. It wasn't even help me decide which house to buy. Should it be the white or the blue? Or I need a job, Lord. Sorry, I quit the last one. Now I don't know what to do. It wasn't any of those things. It wasn't any of those things. It was an understanding heart that Solomon wanted. It was wisdom that Solomon requested. How would the Lord respond to a request such as that? Well, the answer is sitting in verses 11 and 12. And God said unto him, because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked for thyself long life, neither hast asked riches for thyself, nor hast asked the life of thine enemies, but hast asked for thyself understanding to discern judgment. Put simply, because you haven't asked for health, wealth, or prosperity, but because you asked for wisdom. Verse 12, behold, I have done according to thy words. Lo, I have given thee a wise and understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. Verse 13 goes on to say, and I've also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all the days of thy life, all thy days. When we jump ahead to chapter 10, in 1 Kings, we learn that King Solomon was the wisest man, except for the God-man Jesus Christ, and the wealthiest man to ever live on planet Earth. The Bible tells us that he spoke 3,000 proverbs, that he wrote 1,005 songs. Chapter 4 tells us that the kings of the earth came to hear the wisdom of Israel's King Solomon. And it's easy to see why this time in the nation's history is known as Israel's Golden Age. Solomon's wisdom is made known in his judgment of the two harlots. And I know many of you are familiar with the story, who approached him. They were quarreling over an infant that both were claiming to be their own. And fighting over that, and of course, King Solomon was going to pass forth judgment. This is another story from 1 Kings chapter 3. The account has it that two harlots were living in the same house together, and both were pregnant. Their babies, by the way, would be born 3 days apart. And then a dispute took place. The harlot that was addressing Solomon first complained that the other woman's child died in the night because the mother rolled over on that baby and apparently unaware suffocated her infant. What did the dead baby's mother do? Well, according to harlot number 1, who was leveling the charge, the dead baby's mother snuck into her room and swapped the babies while she was sleeping. She told Solomon that it was only when she awoke that she found the baby in her bed was dead, and on closer examination discovered that baby hadn't been hers in the first place. It had belonged to the other woman. It wasn't her baby at all. Harlot number 2 had pulled off a clever switcheroo. She swapped babies and she was out of there. The plaintiffs complain, I want my live baby back. Of course, the defendant, harlot number 2, claimed the harlot number 1 had concocted that whole story. It's a fairy tale, she said. After finding her own baby dead in an attempt to obtain a living baby, she came in and, she's the one that did this. She found her baby dead and swapped it out. Harlot number 2 was lying. The question presented to Judge Solomon was, to which harlot did the living baby belong? Whose baby is it? Well, let's enter the courtroom where Judge Solomon is presiding and about to speak. What will the wise judge decide? Will the live baby go back to harlot number 1? Or will it be awarded to harlot number 2? What will wise Solomon do? Let's pick it up with verse 24 as we continue in chapter 3. And the king said, bring me a sword. And they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, divide the living child in two and give half to the one, half to the other. Why, of course. That's the answer. Both women will go away with part of a baby. With no way to know which mother was lying, to divide the live baby into two would be the only fair thing to do, would it not? Obviously, Solomon's wisdom had not yet shone through, but wise Judge Solomon was about to discover the truth as to whom this baby belonged. The way that the mothers would react to his decree is what wise Solomon wanted to see. Let's return to the courtroom as both the mothers are about to speak here in verse 26. Then spake the woman whose the living child actually was unto the king. For her bowels yearned upon her son. She was aching for that baby, and she said, oh, my Lord, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. But the other said, let it neither be mine nor thine, but divide it. So which mother really cared for the baby? Well, wise King Solomon found out, did he not? King Solomon knew that the lying harlot had nothing to lose. The baby that she truly loved had already died. The true mother had her living baby to lose, and would in no wise want it to be killed. Thus wise King Solomon had discovered the truth as to whom this live baby belonged. Chapter 3 comes to a close with his final decree in verse 27 and the response of the nation in verse 28. Let's take a quick look. Then the king answered and said, give her, the one who said, give it away, let it live, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. She is the mother thereof. And all Israel heard the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in Solomon to do judgment. So now the nation is acknowledging King Solomon's reign and his wisdom. And you can see how Israel was in the zenith of her interlude of blessing, her golden age. That is a familiar story to many listening in, but it shows us the nature of Israel's interlude of blessing as David's son Solomon was reigning over the entire kingdom. Verses 20 and 21 of chapter 4 pretty much sum up the reign of Solomon during the zenith of Israel's golden age. Let's quickly look in here. Judah and Israel were many, as the sand which is by the sea in multitude. eating and drinking and making merry. They were truly in their heyday. And Solomon reigned over all kingdoms, from the river unto the land of the Philistines, and unto the border of Egypt. They brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life. Israel's interlude of blessing, her golden age. God giving them a taste of what it would be like if they'd have him deal with them graciously rather than meritoriously. What a glorious time that was for God's people, and what a glorious taste of that kingdom to come, as we've been saying. The kingdom, God was showing them that taste of that kingdom right there. Solomon had already had an elaborate house built in which he could dwell, but what about a lord for the house? Do you remember David wasn't permitted to build it? It would be David's son that would build it. Do you remember King Hiram, by the way? King Hiram was the one who was king of Tyre, the king of Tyre. And King Hiram was the one who, when he perceived that the Lord had been with David and established David's kingdom earlier on, had sent men and materials to build King David's house. Now King Hiram's coming back on the scene. Of course, David was never able to build a house for the Lord because the Lord had told him his son would build that house. Well, David's son Solomon was now on the throne, and he wanted to build a house for the Lord. The house for the Lord that his father hadn't been permitted to build. So the Lord spoke to Solomon. And we see that in chapter 6, beginning with verse 11. And the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, concerning this house which thou art in building, if thou wilt walk in my statutes, execute my judgments, keep all my commandments to walk in them, then will I perform my word with thee, which I spake unto David thy father. And I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. Well, the house building began. The project's underway, and what an elaborate structure this was going to be. It took 7 years to complete this, and there were no small number of skilled craftsmen involved in the building process. Notice verses 21 and 22 of chapter 6. So Solomon overlaid the house with pure gold, and he made a partition by the chains of gold before the oracle. And he overlaid it with gold, and the whole house he overlaid with gold until he had finished all the house. Also the whole altar that was by the oracle, he overlaid that with gold. That's a lot of gold. More than one artist has used the Bible description of Solomon's temple to either create a model or replica to scale of that temple, or to paint their own depiction of the temple as various artists have envisioned it. As you can see in this rendition, the temple was 90 cubits, or 135 feet long, 35 feet wide, 50 feet high. And remember, overlaid with gold. And this doesn't account for the altar and the sea of bronze that sat before the entrance of the temple. You can't see them here, before the temple proper. And each of these measured approximately 30 feet from side to side. So the temple was not only grandiose in scale, it was stunningly ornate, as the Bible tells us. The whole house was overlaid with gold. That's an incredible structure that Solomon built for the Lord. The entirety of chapter 7 of 1 Kings is spent in providing a detailed description of the temple and its construction. When the temple was complete, the priest brought the Ark of the Covenant into the Holy of Holies. You can see her interlude of blessing, her golden age, and placed it under the wings of the cherubims, which were also overlaid with gold. Once the Ark of the Covenant was in its proper location, the Holy of Holies, notice what took place as recorded in chapter 8, verses 10 and 11. And it came to pass, when the priests were come out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. What a day for the nation Israel. What a taste of her promised kingdom to come. Here are a few of the words that Solomon spoke to the Lord as they appear in verses 22 and 23. He's speaking to the Lord first. And Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the congregation of Israel, and spread forth his hands toward heaven. And he said, Lord God of Israel, there is no God like thee, in heaven above or on earth beneath, who keepest covenant and mercy with thy servants that walk before thee with all their heart. We'll include verses 27 and 28 at this point, because Solomon was obviously overwhelmed with the idea that God's intention was to indeed dwell upon the earth with men. That's what God's earthly repossession plan is all about. And now God's glory was filling the temple that Solomon had built as a dwelling place for the Lord. You see, you can see King Solomon's awe at the fact that God was actually going to dwell in that temple and be among men in verses 27 and 28 as he continued making his prayer before the Lord. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and the heavens of heavens cannot contain thee. How much less this house that I have builded? Yet have thou respect unto the prayer of thy servant and to his supplication, O Lord my God, to hearken unto the cry and to the prayer which thy servant prayeth before this day. King Solomon wanted God to remember that when Israel came to that temple, when they prayed and looked to that temple, when they discovered their incapacity and their sinfulness, they could come to that temple, look to that temple, confess their failure under the contract, and Solomon said, God, forgive them. That was his request. A good part of chapter 8 is taken up with Solomon's prayer to the Most High God. Then toward the conclusion of chapter 8, as we work through 1 Kings, we see Solomon's charge to the people. After praying to God, he turns to the people. Remember that God was dealing with Israel according to a law contract that the nation had sworn they could fulfill, both consistently, perfectly, at the time when the law was set before them. Solomon was saying, get to it, folks, as seen in his words here in verses 61 and 62. Let your heart, therefore, be what? Perfect with the Lord our God, to walk in his statutes and to keep his commandments, as at this day. And the king and all Israel with him offered sacrifice before the Lord. The question is, can any member of the human race be perfect with the Lord, to walk in all his statutes and all his commandments, save Jesus Christ, the God-man? The answer is no, of course, and this was the lesson the law contract was designed to teach his nation. The Apostle Paul, the apostle of the Gentiles, knowing Israel's history, the dictates of the law program, along with the fact that in the flesh dwelleth how much? No good thing, would later make this statement in Romans chapter 3, verse 20 about performance perfection under the law contract. Therefore, would you have it here? Maybe not. Therefore, Paul said in Romans chapter 3, verse 20, therefore by the deeds of the law there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. And I guess they don't have that verse in there. According to the law contract, acceptance before God was to be based upon Israel keeping all of the law all of the time. Israel hadn't done that. God had to place Israel in their land graciously to begin with, as they hadn't merited him working on their behalf by way of their performance. God also dealt with Israel through Joshua graciously. After Joshua, he dealt with Israel through Samuel and through the judges, and he did so graciously in every instance. They continually fell short of measuring up to the dictates of the law they had sworn they could uphold. It became obvious in our study of 1 and 2 Samuel that God had to deal with David graciously, just as he had to deal with those before David, because David hadn't merited righteousness before God by way of his stellar performance either. David's performance was far from perfect, as we saw. In fact, we saw numerous instances where it was downright pathetic when it came to David's behavior. The only way that God could deal with any man was on the basis of man's belief, not on the basis of his behavior. That's what we've been seeing all along. What the Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, is a truth as relevant for the men of time past as it is for our day, and this includes believers. When it comes to righteousness before God that be gained by performance, Paul said, for all have sinned, Romans 3:23, and all are continually, as the verb tense, coming when it comes to performance of the flesh, short of the glory of God. Now Solomon, along with the people of the nation, were getting a good taste of God's grace as God ushered in Israel's golden age, a time like they had never witnessed before. They hadn't earned it. They could never earn it. They didn't deserve it. This was the lesson that God was teaching them, because when it came to the blessings these people were viewing at this point in time, at the zenith of their golden age, he was going to let them know that it hadn't been about them. It hadn't been about their capacity to perform at all. It was solely about him and his capacity to do for his people graciously what they were never able to have him do with them meritoriously. Now, in order to drive that lesson home, the Most High God put a condition upon the continuance of the blessings to Israel. Let's look at that condition. But if ye shall at all turn from following me, ye or your children will not keep my commandments and my statutes which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel out of the land which I have given them. And this house which I have hallowed for my name will I cast out of my sight, in Israel shall be a proverb and a byword among all people. And at this house, which is high, every one that passeth by it shall be astonished and shall hiss. And they shall say, Why hath the Lord done thus unto thy land and unto this house? And they shall answer, Because they forsook the Lord their God, who brought forth their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and have taken hold upon other gods, and have worshipped them, and served them. Therefore hath the Lord brought upon Israel all this evil. What evil? Well, God was giving them a glimpse of the fifth bucket of wrath that was sitting right in their future. Why? Because he put a condition upon his continuing to dwell in that temple. And that condition would be you follow all the dictates of the law that you had sworn to me you could uphold when it was passed down to you at Mount Sinai. And what's God going to prove to the nation? That fifth bucket's going to come, just as it was promised earlier on, because they would never be able to perform up to the dictates of the law contract. So God was telling them right there, if you'll do this, I'll continue to be in that house. But if you don't look for me to be in that house. What's Israel got in their future? Well, we're sitting on the doorstep of the second bucket of wrath, as God's forewarning them ahead of time, this is coming. When you fail to do what you've sworn you could do, this is coming, Israel. Watch out. And they didn't make their confession that they failed, as we're going to see as we continue on in the book of 1 Kings and watch Solomon's behavior after all these wonderful prayers to God and his admonition to the people.